Have I? Oh, sorry. Spacebar. Shall I do?
That's right.
That's right. If I close it, I'll just close it. Is it brought down? Okay. Fine. Well, that's an act, old Tom, to follow, eh? Still, we'll do our best. Now, what has interested me really is coming to something called on landscape. Because as a photographer, nearly everything appeals to me as subject matter. I do not specialize in any particular genre or photographic methodology. Consequently, I would never call myself a landscape photographer. And a bit like Tom, I found difficulty with that word anyway. So why am I here, you might rightly ask? But I believe that photographs are illusions of reality, so maybe I am too. But I must say in my defense that I've always had a personal and professional connection with the land, nature and the countryside. And consequently, I have often made much of my work there. Whilst putting together this presentation, and forgive me for reading it because this first part I wanted to get right, if it turns out okay, I worked out during the research for this first part of the presentation that I had only lived 10 of my 77 years in a city. What I discovered over those many decades, though, is that when you make pictures, you are in the moment. You are rather than at a particular place. And where I photograph is where I am, as well as who I am. So I put some text slides in here as well, like other people. I hope they make sense and they don't sound too sort of censorious and academic. But it's quite useful sometimes to have these there. Now, the thing that, as I said, that interests me particularly is, definitions of landscape. Now, this was quite an interesting one that I saw. A landscape is everything you can see when you look across imagination and reality. Now, I thought that was pretty good. But landscape definition, if you look up in the dictionary, landscape photography, I should say, shows spaces within the world, sometimes vast and unending, but other times microscopic. Well, that's bloody well everything, pretty well, isn't it? And I had to grapple. I'd forgotten this really when Tim invited me, that actually some years ago I wrote about landscape photography in the 20th century for the Oxford Companion to the Photograph, which is a very thick tome, as you can imagine. You're probably aware of those Oxford Companions to theatre and music and so on and so forth. But they do make a very good doorstop. But it is available online. In the end, I had to divide, had to subsection this piece for them into modernism and landscape, metaphor and transcendentalism, the Adams factor, that's not the Adams family, that's Ansel, new topographics, colour, and art and politics. So I'd like to share some of those observations with you that reflect my investigations into the genre before talking about my own photography, or practice, as we're told to call it now by the younger generation of academics and writers who have nicked it from fine art education, but we won't go there. So this picture, interesting, was actually in a shop in Porto. Now, what interests me is how the land and landscape have been commodified. That's one of the things I find, quite interesting. And, you can see it here in a very, wonderful example of commodification, especially when you see that the new fragrances have been blended to evoke the spirit of national parks with the spring/summer collection placing the spotlight on 4 iconic national parks. Do you know what the Brecon Beacons smells like, or what it should smell like? Or Exmoor, or the Peak District, or the Yorkshire Dales, which is, you know, quite interesting. And when I was looking out the window, as you probably are, shall I show you that one again? It's just lovely, isn't it? Yeah. So when you look out, when you're having your lunch, when you're looking outside and you're seeing that waterfall, you see that in some senses the Regid Centre, is that right? Regid, that's how it's pronounced, isn't it? Has commodified the landscape as well. You know, it's been created, they are creating a landscape, this centre. The water coming over the quarries, I presume it was quarries, but it's been reconstructed, creating, you know, a landscape. And I think that is, you know, is quite interesting. It shows you the effect and shows you the power, really, of the effect of landscape aesthetic and the feelings of what we consider to be nature, and how that is reconstructed for our pleasure or for our comfort. Now, recently I was in Portugal, looking through a gallery window at the landscape. Well, it was actually a sculpture park garden outside. It's a wonderful place if you've ever been there. But the thin mesh screen over the glass of the window got in the way. In a sense, that fascinated me, because what was happening, I was learning something I hadn't seen before by putting this camera. It was an iPhone to my eye, and just trying to see something. I saw that there was something out there, but the mesh got in the way. But the mesh was more interesting in some sort of way, and it really formed that sort of veil in the left-hand picture. You can see the landscape behind. So what the camera rendered was very different to what I thought I saw, or what I wanted to see. Because then, you know, so I'm sure you always find that people have talked to me about things that didn't work out and things that were better and so on and so forth than they anticipated, and when they got the film back, you know, a week later from the processors or whatever, it was completely different. And I think that's it. Your photographs that you produce are great teachers. They will teach you a lot more than something you predetermine. I was pointing the phone camera at the view, but I could only minimally control, and I thought at the time, well, is that a landscape photograph? Because I was thinking this was following being invited by Tim to come here, and I thought, you know, what is this category, landscape, which obviously has been defined by other people, or landscape photography? Is it like street photography and travel photography? Whatever the fuck those are, I don't read. When I started these ambiguous and vacuous compartments thankfully did not exist. But we'll come back to those sort of issues later. I think what I am trying to say is that the personal approach, why are you there, what are you doing, the why rather than the how, is always been very important to me. Now let's start further back. In evolutionary terms, man wanted to use him or herself as image to reference or memorialize what mattered most in their lives. For example, animals. When much later survival was not so much an essential part of life, what happened then was contemplation of our existence, where we came from, what are we here for, almost certainly began to dominate, you know, our ancestors' thinking time, and their betters, the stronger, nastier or brighter, dictated the agenda, as always, of course. The cave eventually became the built house, and drawn pictograms became painted vistas on the wall. And if you're rich, the pictures are put into ornate gold frames too. The frame determines what you are supposed to see. Framed pictures are given material value as well by the display. So it must be what we should aspire to, appreciate, even revere. The view is aesthetically pleasing, awesome, but non-threatening, and if it was realistically crafted to make us feel that we could be there, that gave the framework even more status, and the artist more kudos. Commercial success would surely follow, and it did for many, as painted views of the natural landscape became a popular genre for artists from the 17th century rather than the background as it had been before. The entry of photography in the middle of the 19th century put the cat amongst the pigeons for most artists, but released the more ideas and ways to put paint on rectangles and squares, as we know. I love this picture, Francis Bedford. As well as exploring the pictorialist painterly aesthetic, commercially minded photographers exploited the burgeoning market for souvenirs as the railways and the romantics opened up the British hills and dales to an ever-widening public. These 19th century album prints were sold at post offices and hotels and avidly put into the buyers' albums. Scottish pioneer photographer George Washington Wilson from Aberdeen alone sold over 500,000 prints in 1864. Photographers, not painters, could now do the views. And although they may be in monochrome, they were perceived as being much more like real life, despite the limitations at the time of the medium. John Sikowski, who I think is one of the best writers on photography, was curator at the Museum of Modern Art in New York, put together a fantastic book which influenced me. We were talking about influences earlier, a great deal. Was called The Photographer's Eye. And at the beginning of his introductions, he says this, and I think this is really so important, that as a result of the Age of Enlightenment, the 19th century began by believing that what was reasonable was true, the rational and, getting away with the religion, thought, intellect and so forth, and scientific developments were at the core of the development of man, and not, some grey-haired person in the sky. And it would end up by believing that what it sought a photograph of was true. And I think, we still have. That was the biggest shift in human visual perception since those, in my opinion, since those cave drawings. So that development had gone on, that recognition had gone on, but in a sense it was a sort of a form of appropriation, photography had appropriated from fine art, an aesthetic, an easel art approach. And it still goes on. This is Water's Meat, taken recently. And, Getty, it's looking a bit tired, that aesthetic, isn't it? Never mind. A very familiar, let's say, less tired, more familiar. But the colour postcards and the reproduction sell well. And, Getty Images' commodification of the landscape and nature, which you can, obviously see here, and the profits that come from that, will attest. But, that is one sort of attitude towards the landscape. It's certainly that, or investigations that I've found by doing this, that taught me a lot about what was happening, or made me think, what was happening was something that was even more insidious in some ways, because it gives people that sense of achievement rather than the exploration of doing new things and going their own ways can give you, which I think is much more satisfying. So I think what has happened is not only that the landscape and nature have been commodified, as I was saying before, but I think in photography the landscape look has become a commodity as well. And I think it is illusionary. This is illusionary because it's an artifice. But it continues, as I said, to dominate pictorial views, which rarely reflect the 21st century life, which, you know, we see every day, because they are mostly an antidote to our lives, or an escape from it. Electricity pylons, wind farms, motorways, and urbanization are what we mostly see every day. Mountains, seashores, glens are what we want to see. This is understandable, but why do we still want to photograph them, these situations, these scenes, these views, in the same ways that have been done millions of times before, at least for a century and a half? But does the quality of the image translate, you know, into value? You know, the hard work, the craft that has gone on, the cost even. It all depends on context, and as we know, the difference between a flower and a weed is a matter of judgment. Now, here is another example of value, if you like, where you can place a certain sort of value because it's there, it's money, and so that really is important. I just got this from an auction site, and it's an Alex Soth, and you can see that I've seen a lot more engaging pictures than this today, but look at the price. It's estimate $20,000 to $30,000. It's a limited edition of 5, I think, printed. Yes, this is number 3 of 5. But the other thing that is quite important, I think, and perhaps maybe is why the value is one of the elements in the valuation, is that the print is 5 foot by 4 foot. So, you know, this is for those of us who throughout the years have done our work, made our photographic work, some of which may be landscape, some of which may be other genres and other areas, you know, and see that this price has been asked for, and very often you think, well, how did that happen? How the hell where did we go wrong? You know, why aren't our works, you know, work 30 to 60 cents? And they're bloody better than that, you know. So this is a very funny thing. So the art market is a world in its own. And, you know, this is something that fascinates me, but it also frustrates me. And I'm sure that Tom will have a view on that. Now, in the beginning, so back, you know, to my own work and my own sort of efforts with dealing with making photographs that have in some way, shape or form have a landscape or natural or countryside connection. Although I have worked, you know, quite successfully in commercial photography, and mostly in my case, I was editorial photographer. Did everything, you know, from sports photography to photographing politicians and so on and so forth. I haven't shown any of these here, but you can always look on my website, and it seems, you know, but that's part of my background. But one of the interesting things, I suppose, really, was that I did have that sort of background. So when I moved from being a reporter to a photographer, you know, I at least, you know, had some experience of the area that I was working in. But my interest in photography actually came primarily through, like a lot of people, through a hobby. I love being in the hills. You know, my hobby was rock climbing, and although I did work for about a year as an outdoor pursuit instructor in Snowdonia, I was at the time a newspaper reporter, and occasionally, you know, I combined the two. And I moved. One of the things that, because I was working in newspapers and then was as a photojournalist and freelance, and I worked for The Guardian and The Observer and some of the colour magazines, you know, people saw my byline. I got invitations to give talks about my my career and what I did and being a photojournalist in various colleges, including Derby and Trent Polytechnic, and that's how I got the job there, and also including in Manchester Polytechnic when Martin Parr was a student there, and Daniel Meadows and Brian Griffin. And because that was a time of change, that was a time when photography was being thought of as something that actually could be considered an art form. And the magazine Creative Camera was very influential. The Photographers Gallery opened in 1971. About the same time, I had an exhibition there in the first year of its life, and so things were moving along. The Arts Council starting to support photography and so on. So going into photographic education was when I was invited to have a full-time job at Trent Polytechnic. It wasn't really. It was something that was unusual in many respects, but it had a logic in terms of my own development in terms of photography. I'd been Rupert Murdoch had just taken over the Sun, which I'd worked for, which wasn't the Sun as it is today, a red top. Well, the Sun doesn't. Yeah, it does still exist, doesn't it? Yes, it's the News of the World that's gone. Anyway, and so it marked a real sea change in British newspapers and in the media generally, and there was a vulgarisation and so on and so forth. And I was really quite depressed about what was happening, and the teaching invitations came along. So I accepted the job and moved into the Peak District of Derbyshire in 1974, and eventually, obviously, meeting up with Tom was there, and I realised that my photography was becoming more personal and experimental, because being in this an art college environment, there was risk taking. There wasn't a marketplace that I was, if you like, that I was making my pictures for, although I tried as a photojournalist to be different and try and get some interesting pictures and angles and look at the world in a bit of a different way. But one of the things that I found by working with students and working with my fellow lecturers, who were all photographers, and of that which includes people like Tom, his predecessor, John Mulvaney, and John Blakemore, Ray Moore, and others. And it was really an education for me working with these people, and also my experience was different to their experience because of my newspaper background. Hopefully, I passed on some of the things to them and also to the students. And one of the things that I found essential, it was going back to John Sikowski, because I started reading his writings as well as others, and seeing the books that exhibitions he put together. There were three things really, if you're reasonably competent and you manage to handle a camera and process and all the rest of it, that you only need to know in photography, and that's light, frame, and vantage point. And that was, that really, taught me quite a lot. As I said, the previous picture, I was able to put together my writing and my pictures together. We're talking about climbing, but then the work that I was doing at this particular time was actually putting the landscape in the background. They were about other things. As you can see, the picture before was about the frame, what you put in and out of the frame. And this was also recognising the frame and vantage point. It's quite strange, this picture. It's been, it was made in 1975, but recently there've been a lot of shows. The last 2 years there've been shows looking about creating the countryside. There's another exhibition down in Eastbourne about the countryside and the British photography related to it. At the moment, there is a similar exhibition on at the Hepworth in Wakefield, and this picture appears in. And it is nature or landscape or context that it's shown in. But also, it was in an exhibition at the Graves Gallery in Sheffield, which was on street views, which I thought was quite strange. So, and I said, well, why was it? Well, you can see a road down below. So, curators work in many mysterious ways, but it made a certain sort of logic. This was if you like, there was a exploration. There was political statements and things like that I suppose I was more interested in making with the pictures as well. Then in 1979 approximately, and then for the next 10 years. I started because I was living out in the countryside in the Peak District, photographing fields and walls and paths and trackways, dead hares, foxes and badgers, because those are the sort of things that I would be seeing pretty well every day. I mean, I live a mile from the southern edge of the Peak National Park, and when I open my back door, I walk into an archetypal British landscape. But what interests me is, what is it? How do I engage with it as a photographer and as an individual as well? And what determines that to a certain extent is that I'm a resident. I choose to work in, to live in this environment for reasons because I've always recreated in the rural areas, the countryside. I've climbed and walked and so on. So it's only natural. My family on my mother's side were all related to the land farming and so on. And so I felt it was a natural place for me because to find a home when we moved over to the East Midlands when I got the job in Nottingham. And so when I started to think about the landscape, because I'd obviously walked a lot in the Peak District by this time, because this was in 1979, it was 5 years after we'd moved there, I thought, well, I'm a resident, I'll be doing it differently. I'll sort of contain my photography within a small compass. And I described a 2-mile radius from where I lived to start making my first pictures. One of the interesting things actually about, and this is the wonderful thing about a resident, is these two examples, is that you come across a two-tone field. I mean, that's it. Excuse me. I mean, I like dividing pictures into halves, and it's reminiscent of earlier pictures that I've taken and later pictures also, because I like that sort of the sense of the mark making is very important. The making, that's what we do when we're taking photographs. It's a mark making process to a certain extent. You're not using a pencil, but you're using silver halides or pixels. It's still mark making, and of course the electric fence has just been taken away the day before, and I happened to, so you got these partly grazed and partly ungrazed by the animals. And here the tree was just been felled and cut up by the farmer it was like a deconstructed tree, and it's quite interesting. It has it's two-dimensional flat tree, but it has the same sort of shape as the actual standing tree. And what I think I find interesting is that half the population of Britain lives within an hour of where I live, an hour of the national park. So tourism is our area's biggest employer. And reliant very much, that industry, on the partial and persuasive use of photography to attract visitors in order to maintain an economic stability for the inhabitants and mostly rural community. Whilst enjoying being amongst the hills and the dales, visitors indulge in the largest creative pastime in the world, photography. And they nearly always attempt to recreate the images that persuaded them to visit the area in the first place. Something different, it seems very often, is rarely a considered option. And I just wondered, why. And this is, fulminated within me for a long time. And I think I found as a resident that when I was making single pictures, what didn't satisfy me, because it didn't give a sense of time that I noticed in different seasons. And so these are just two examples of, or those previous ones are two examples of what I'm talking about. And so what I learned from confining my activities to that space, was that you could experiment a bit more. You could think about how other pictures together. I knew about sequencing and on gallery walls and in books and things like that, but this was making me feel more obviously and directly about those sort of issues. I didn't, and this became a book called White Peak, Dark Peak, which I didn't want it to signal a particular style or signature. I just wanted, if you like, my interest in what was happening in the landscape would dictated the way that I put the pictures I chose and the bits of writing that I put in. And because I walk a lot, I prefer to travel light, because most of these pictures are taken with a 35mm with occasional.
I'll just bend that out for a moment.
Oh,
That's all right.
can you hear me? All right. Yeah. So this is useful because, as I said before, I believe vantage point is one of the most important parts of photography. And if you're scrambling up crags and even up trees to improve and experiment, with your field of view, you don't want to be constricted by a big camera and several lenses, not to mention a tripod. It's difficult enough contending with the vagaries of our climate, ploughing through bogs, leaping over streams, negotiating access and contending with snarling dogs, with having to be a Sherpa too. And so, this inevitably, governs how you see. And in some senses, less for me is more. And because it gives, for me, a more visual options, and being a bit of a rock climber, obviously I like the tactile contact with land. So going back to why people come to the Peak District or other national parks, and apart from trying to get a bottle of Airwick to remind you of what it smells like, why do they take very similar photographs? And this is something that I think was touched on earlier about that. And so it is, I don't know why it is. Maybe some people will answer, to make a replica of what we believe and are told has quality, I suppose, and gives us a sense of achievement. And it seems to offer affirmation, even to professionals, that you can produce an accredited photograph. And this is relatively easy nowadays, as digital cameras can be said to be virtually de-skilled photography, with software programs that for almost every contingency. It's also easy to be tempted, by the intelligent auto button, and why not? But I think what happens is, to a certain extent, people don't take on board, that sense of freedom that going your own way and taking risks could take you. Why are you there? What are you doing it for? And all those sort of questions that I think are so important, maybe to other things in life. Do we get onto the railway tracks of convention and imitation? And that doesn't seem to be the right way to go. And, of course, our social and educational cultural background does establish our visual literacy and how we interpret photographs. So, if somebody likes something, and it has that accreditation, and we're told it's good, it's inevitable that they will think that there was quality and that's what to do. But in my opinion, the majority of landscape photographs rarely challenge or surprise. I mean, they may, in terms of the event or the phenomena that is being photographed, absolutely. So in a sense they're documentary, or can be documentary. But is there a sort of a repetition of a particular aesthetic that goes right back to easel art? And I think that's what I found interesting, and I think as I mentioned before, is working with people and talking to other photographers and if you like, absorbing their experience and influences, made me, perhaps the photographer I am, today. And one of the things that you don't actually see very often are the nastier side of national parks, or maybe the rubbish. You never consider that very often, or something which is a bit unusual. Things that actually are on the land and are an important part, of agricultural life. And as I said, I found hearing those stories and learning from those experiences made me think about why, and I think that's really important. That sort of that question that maybe is not asked as often, as we'd like, because in a sense, taking pictures in the landscape is a wonderful therapy to a large extent, and why shouldn't it be? But the investigation that takes place in terms of what you are looking at and what's important, about the subject matter, I think has a relevance to it. And I found that by working with these people and educating myself, helped place me on the photographic map. And obviously doing dialogue with photography, as I said, was an important part of that, as well as, teaching. And what interested me, because I was for my sins, I was once on the council of the Royal Photographic Society. And I found that a lot of people who were there and making assessments about photographs were unfamiliar. I think it's changed a lot since those days with the history of photography, let alone the history of art. So they were making aesthetic judgments and telling people whether they got associateships or fellowships or whatever it was, and they really were quite ignorant. And and this was I found that quite surprising. So that is one reason I think why questioning your activities or our activities is so important. And I think one of the things I come back to is being myself and considering, obviously contemporary and historical practices, but also, challenging the status quo. Becoming aware of photographic cliches and trying to push them and go beyond them, and obviously, to try and challenge. And nearly 40 years ago, I wrote a book which in fact is still in print, and the new edition is coming out in 2 years, called Approaching Photography, and it challenged the facile categorization of photographic genres. And I tried to advocate that photographers should make work that was driven by the desire to say something rather than to show something. It appears that, looking at that, that was 40 years ago, and there's still an element of that sort of status quo, that lack of chance taking, and that we see in many of the photographic magazines around us. And I find that quite dispiriting. I can understand how it happens, but it's a bit dispiriting. But one should also remember that obviously today's cliches were breakthroughs from the past. But one of the things I do find interesting and relevant to my own practice is that the camera can anchor you to a specific place or to an idea, and that enables you to explore and observe and represent both the external world and our internal reactions to it. I mean, this is hard, it's not easy. So the adoption of the same scenic formula and geeky obsession with techniques, even the wonderful zone system, Ansel, it's understandable. It's very understandable. It puts a sense of worth and craft and so forth on the images. But what we see a lot of, and there's nothing wrong with this, but you see a lot of it, are waterfalls using slow shutter speeds, shafts of light descending through gaps in the cloud, and the trusty old wooden jetty thrusting its way towards some watery infinity. But photography, can offer so much more than this, and I think if we should challenge the accepted norms and explore ideas and provoke. Whenever photography, landscape photography comes up, the words beautiful and beauty are often used. It was mentioned earlier by Charlie. What moves us, I asked the question here, to call something like a sunset beautiful. We put the word beauty on certain subject matter, but what makes it often confusing is that there is no clear consensus on what beauty actually is. Maybe we feel a sense of harmony, a soothing sensation, or a gut feeling when we contemplate what for us are beautiful things. Beauty is a thing you have to feel inwardly, but never assume that what you think of as beautiful is going to be appreciated as beautiful by other people. I resist the assertions of those who try to brainwash people into accepting their definition of beauty as, the only valid one. Beautiful, the sense of experimentation, I think, is important. So that photographs that promote the picturesque may be, pleasant and soothing, but they confirm an idea of pastoral bliss, which may not be accurate. Are you still with me? Yeah, that's right, yeah. But the things that I found, this is quite interesting, this one. That's just come up. It's a dead wallet. Remember this, Tom? Christmas Day. Tom was staying with the Christmas Day many years, I think it was 1983 or something like that. And we came across this dead wallaby in the Roaches, for those who probably know that area. And so that was quite interesting, and it may have been apocryphal, but we found it. And this interest that I have in trying to do something different was obviously a case in point in putting together White Peak, Dark Peak, where I was able to deal with round images and putting mats on prints and so forth. So that, because it didn't seem that, I think the photographs that promote the picturesque are pleasant and soothing, but they confirm that pastoral bliss, as I said before. But that, it's not always that accurate.
10 minutes.
Okay. So this sense of experimentation when I moved into colour, was obviously at the foreground of my involvement. This is not necessarily a landscape photograph, but it gives you some sort of idea, because I was always to go with what I was doing, what I was experimenting with at that particular time. And it was a release, to get into colour for the first time and have a routine, because I'd been very much a black and white photographer, and I got I knew the language, I felt I did, and I could see in black and white and so on and so forth. So we're moving into colour with something, and I started off taking pictures with my dog on walks and things like that, and using flash and experimenting in that sort of way. And here, I was sort of making, later on, this was a landscape out of a stencil that my grandson in fact, had painted on a door, and mud formed a landscape. And so, but it's a door. So there was making landscapes in a different way. My own self in the land was a feature of this particular picture. So that sense of bringing yourself into the picture and not thinking that you are not part of the experience. You're not this potential subject matter of the journey that you are undertaking. So I recently have been thinking more about bringing oneself into the landscape more directly. The obvious way is probably through shadows. This is in Morocco, but that, I think, at the end of the day, is I do it because it strikes me as an interesting photograph, first and foremost. I'm not thinking about the landscape, but the landscape is where I am, and so where I am, I take pictures. So it makes a sort of logical sense. And then, why not experiment with the landscape in other sort of ways? Think of it as a playground where fun, you're in particular places and you're doing something. In this case, Maria is doing cartwheels. Okay, it may not be what normally you would expect to see, or maybe it is, but it's something that I think we should think about, particularly as we think seriously about what we do. And you wouldn't be here if you didn't think about that. But why should Edinburgh be photographed in the traditional way, where you get onto that platform, that path that goes up, those crags, and then take the skyline of Edinburgh. You know, when I lived in Edinburgh for a while, the first thing I noticed, because I didn't know, I knew the city, but I didn't know Arthur's Seat particularly well. By going up, down, it presented some fantastic vistas on itself, as it were, the paths that obviously are an important feature as I saw them, but people ignore them. To me, you know, they're there, they're interesting, and they, to me, photographically, they're as interesting as the castle and all the spires that dominate the city. And you know, you can bring the landscape into an urban environment, if you like, or reflect on it in some sort of way, or reference it. And here it's this is the wall of Armley Prison, you know. So there's that sort of juxtaposition. There's an opportunity to make, you know, visual metaphors, and as well as wonderful vistas and operatic grandeur, which sometimes are very evident in terms of seascapes and landscapes that we've seen today. It's the land is the stuff under your feet, and it's all there. It's all around us, you know. And it doesn't necessarily have to be in those remote and exotic places. Those, you know, parks that have been sort of set in aspic, you know, the Peak District is a very worked landscape, you know, and so that's really good. It's not wilderness. It is, you have access to cities not far away. So the sort of cultural connections that you like to make as a person, you know, are possible. But then you can go into areas of remoteness, which if you're a resident, you know quite intimately and well. And so it always possible. Why is it, you know, that we think about landscape in a particular way? Why is it that we want to replicate, you know, what has been done so many times before? And you know, this, as I said, has always fascinated me, and and I think really it's not about thirds, and this is what has been said before, or the conjunction of the horizon with the azure blue sky, or you know, even grand vistas. It's much more than that. And the countryside, because you have an interest in it, may be the reason why you're there, in the ecology, the wildlife, even health and fitness, or the topography, history, or plants, or like me, you know, you live there anyway. And surely this is going to influence the way that you make photographs. I've almost, just as a bit of a technical thing, I've almost always used the 35mm camera, as I said before, with a moderately wide angle lens. I've been using recently, since 2010, a Lumix Panasonic, but with a 24-90 equivalent lens. But mostly I use an iPhone, and I think both cameras can produce acceptable images. They've been published and made, you know, big prints have been made for gallery use as well. So you know, my approach to landscape is largely influenced by my physical connection with the land. It's pretty obvious what I've said before, the climbing and the mountaineering, and also where I live, which I've referred to because it's in the countryside, and my curiosity. You know, I'm a nosy bugger, and I used to be, you know, a journalist, so that comes with it. I'm a son of a police detective, so, you know, it's in the genes. And so I like to see what I'm, you know, understand the story behind what I'm pointing my camera at. That really intrigues me. But it's, you know, but it's only, but it is only one subject matter. The nature, landscape, the countryside around. And when I foreground it, as I have in some of the pictures I've shown you here, it's because I want to make photographs to see what the thing I photograph actually looks like as a photograph. Now that sounds confusing, doesn't it? But I think I know what I mean. And it's a quote actually from Gary Winogrand. I take photographs to see what things look like when photographed. And I think what better reason, so you can be anywhere and at any time to take photographs. And I'm sure you know that, so we don't have to be stuck in one particular compartment. for our photography pleasure. And I've just finished with the sequence, and this, if you make it with an iPhone, but it gives you an idea. I was staying in an apartment, and it has references to Cézanne that was made earlier, funnily enough. It was my homage to Cézanne. We're staying in this balcony window, and looked at this skyline, this mountain, and I was fascinated by it because I loved the shape of it, and it's a horizon. And I've said, I don't take skies and horizons very often. They're much too serious for me, much more difficult to do. But this is a feature of this sequence, and which I'd like to finish with. Thank you.
Well, that wraps up the first day of the Meeting of Minds conference. We've had 4 very diverse and interesting speakers, and we've just had a fantastic afternoon with Thomas and Paul chatting about various things. And covered quite a lot of ground between you both. Yes, and I'll first say thank you very much for coming, because it's we enjoyed this.
My honor. And like I say, to be in the company of my dear friend, and it seems increasingly mentor, Mr. Hill, you offered me a treat I couldn't have passed, and if I had, I'd been a damn fool. Well, thank you from my heart for that.
How did you actually meet Paul in the first
He
place?
took me under his wing. How did we meet? You took me under your wing, though.
Yeah, I think it was. I mean, he came over, just having left his master's program on a sort of exchange. We had this relationship with the University of New Mexico, and the course leader at the time, Bill Gaskins, was a friend of Van Deren Coates, who was the dean, I think was the dean, and already one alumni from New Mexico had come over, John Mulvaney, and then Tom was the second one, and Tom stayed for about 3 years, and
More than they wanted me to.
yes, but when it happened, there were all sorts of little problems that occurred in terms of getting into the country, which
Illegal immigrants?
No. It was okay. No. So it was in a sort of rubber boat, and we got No, it was and also he was on his own, and his energy, and as well as his experience, was something that at that particular time was something that meant a lot to me, and I think we taught together on the first year. And that team teaching seemed to work quite well. And
That's the photographer's place.
no, that was at Trent Polytechnic in Nottingham, and we had a good bunch of students. There were only 6 advanced courses in photography at that time, funnily enough. I mean, there's so many degree courses now in photography. And so it was good, and obviously Tom was, I was probably the first professional photographer that he'd actually...
Can't even begin to, it sounds sycophantic, it probably is, but I never knew anybody that had published anything. Paulie did it daily, weekly, monthly. And always he knew people. I've always been slightly, now entirely hermetic, but it was magic. And also, has to be said, Paulie's family took me in, and God, they let this crazy, young, stupid, very inexperienced person roam with their family. It's never to be forgotten, Paul.
What was your intention when you came over? Was it just to stay over for a short period?
I don't know intention. I was lucky, really seriously lucky to get in the country, as it turns out. A minor mishap at the border that I'd like to forget. No, the English border, Heathrow detention cell. Yeah, in a manacle and straitjacket. Jesus, I have a difficult temper at the wrong time and place. Anyway.
Not the airport is a good idea.
Well, not with a security guard. Fuck, mistake. But anyway, I was the last on this guy, Professor Koch's list of available people. He'd given the opportunity for this job to his 5 favorite people. I was the last on the list. None of them wanted to do it, and I couldn't get out of the country fast enough. I had a one-way ticket, which didn't please the immigration people either. And then I was told this thing. I didn't know where Nottingham was. I'd never been out of America, north. I've been in Canada, Mexico. I'd never, totally unworldly. And after I finally got myself extricated from the difficulties, I was told to go to, Euston Station near St. Pancras. I thought, Houston Station and they've got a Pancras Station? What the fuck is this? I had no idea where I was. I couldn't understand anything, and of course I didn't have any money, which is the story of my life. I've never had any money ever since, and Paulie saw a poor slob when he saw one, and his sweet wife it sounds really silly, but Paul was nice to me, and Angela was the best cook I'd ever known in my life, and so I had this amazing habit of arriving at dinner time. Fuck, man, am I here at dinner time? Wow. Oh, I can stay? Fantastic. Are you sure? I'll do the dishes. Big love, man. Big love. Never to be forgotten, Paulie. And, we taught, and here's this person who wildly publicly experienced. I had a lot to say, but no experience how to focus it. I learned. Gratitude is unconditional and lifelong. I've always followed this man. I'm very happy to follow him now. There are times when we've irritated the fuck out of each other, as I'm absolutely sure you recall, but it's devotional for me. I've almost never had a friendship. I'm hard to like, by the way, because I'm not very nice, but I've almost never had a friendship like the one I have in this gentleman. And his family meant more to me than anything but my own. And I'm really grateful to you. This was an amazing experience, and the people you've surrounded yourself with and the community you've built. I think about these things, but I've never experienced it. Closest I ever experienced to anything was through Paul.
So did you ever have any intention of going back to America at the time, or was that just that you found...
Lots of intention. I hated the government. I had no money, so it was between dislike of the government and now I'll never go back. I'll go back to visit, but I'm an American artist, but I don't like the way America's turned out and the fact that they've elected a total jerk who's dismembering democracy in front of my eyes and nobody seems to care. That upsets me. And I'm not even a political person. I'm not very smart either. But if an idiot like myself can see shit coming down, then why can't 330 million others? It upsets me. It's a good place. For a time, it was imbued with ideals, which is why I like Britain, a place filled with ideals, as well as the most extraordinary English language. It's your native language. It's not mine, or that, like that lassie, second language stuff. No idea the gobsmacking amazement of English. For somebody that comes from where I come from, man, this is like nirvana. English, the history, the continuity, the idealism. English.
Now, I just wanted to ask about your work, because I know it's coming towards the end of, or the conclusion, not the end, in a way, of your large project. Can you tell us a little bit, anything about where it's going?
It's going to be at the Los Angeles County Museum of Art. It's going to open on the 21st or 22nd of September 2019. There's going to be about 75, not a huge amount of pictures. It's 8,500 square feet, and some about another equal number in what they cleverly call cases, and show small things. And then there'll be a book called The World's Edge, the Atlantic Basin Project.
And that's for next year?
Yeah, and then I've got a little show in New York in a museum in the weird Hamptons, which I've never, in Long Island, thought I'd ever go to. The biggest private home in America is being built there. What horseshit is that? Some rich guy is spending something like $300 million building a 200-bedroom private house. What the fuck? What do you do that for? What? It's like a hotel for yourself. Anyway, I was deeply stunned, and so I made this project called Refuge. New work to remind all the people in the Hamptons, a lot of whom presumably don't want the people that want to visit from the south to come north, that historically all of the Long Islanders are refugees from Puritan New England. And there's a single site in Long Island called Conscience Point, where the beginning of the immigration of the religiously downtrodden from New England came to settle and find new lives and better economic circumstances for themselves in what is now the Hamptons. And I built an entire project on that called Refuge. Let's see if they speak to me or allow the pictures on the wall.
And yourself, you have a new book?
Yeah,
new book,
I know. Yeah, the Approaching Photography is going to go into its third edition, bringing it up to date in 2 years' time.
Updating it as well?
I've got to update it because it's at the moment it's nearly all black and white pictures. So there's now people think digitally first. You know, if it's a didactic, it's a teaching book. So you have to, you have to. But there are a lot of students, which is really good, who and adult. I mean, experienced photographers who are going to use film, and maybe they're scanning their negatives, but they really, so the black and going to black and white. So black and white, isn't going to be completely, phased out. It couldn't be, because there's a historical context in the book as well. But contemporary practice can be, can be evidenced obviously in black and white work. But most of it's going to be the new editions are going to bring it up to date with social media, with iPhones, with all of that, but also with the digital revolution.
Fantastic. Well,
I just have to. Paul's mentioned in his talk, and I was gobsmacked, of course, and I mean it sincerely. There's a missing body of British work that's so important to be published, and it's the work that he's done from the late 1960s through the early 1980s that he showed very beautifully things from a group of things, diverse things. But I hope either somebody who listens to this realize this is one of the two most important missing bodies of work in contemporary English picture making, the other being a true survey of Ray Moore's work. And if neither happen, that's a tragedy for British culture in general and a monster mishap for photographic understanding. In particular, there's crucially important bodies of work. And Paulie, make somebody pay attention. I don't know how you do these things.
It's just money.
I do understand.
Yes, it's money. Yeah.
But this is this work is historically important and extraordinarily wonderful.
Well, if there is anybody out there
Yes.
that is willing to sponsor a book, that would be fantastic.
And thank you, Tim, and Charlotte and the team for the great work that you've done putting this conference together.
Well, thank you very much.
You and Charlotte make it look simple.
It doesn't feel like that.
Gray hair should be in evidence here.
It's like that swan's legs thing.
Yes.
Yes, that's the one. But we'll call it a day there. Thank you very much for staying with us all day. And we look forward to starting tomorrow morning at around 9 o'clock. So, good night.